Okay, well, let's get started here. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Carolyn Hoxby. Dr. Hoxby is the Scott and Danya Balmer Professor of Economics at Stanford University, and also the Director of the Economics of Education Program at the National Bureau for Economic Research. Her research has received numerous awards, including a Carnegie Fellowship, the John M. Olin Fellowship, a National Tax Association Award, and the 2006 Thomas J. Fordham Prize for Distinguished Scholarship. I think that was the last time we saw each other, was it that reception? Dr. Hoxby has written extensively on educational choice and related issues of labor economics. She is the editor of The Economics of School Choice, right here, a book I highly recommend to you, especially since I co-author a chapter. And also College Choices, which I'll still recommend to you, even though I don't co-author a chapter. I could go on, but suffice it to say that Carolyn Hoxby is one of the most accomplished economists of her generation. She's probably also one of the most exhausted at this point because she had to endure a flight from San Francisco to Atlanta overnight so that she could fly from Atlanta to here this morning. But if I know Caroline, she will draw upon her seemingly endless reserve of energy to present a fascinating description of her research on the promise and performance of charter schools. So let's welcome Carolyn Hoxby.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I'm delighted to be here in northwest Arkansas. This is my first time to this part of the state, and it's beautiful, so I wish I were staying longer. Today I'm going to be talking about charter schools, and you should feel free to interrupt me if you have a question as I go along. You don't have to save them for the end. And let's just get started. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about where we're going today. We're going to spend most of our time on one or two studies, but I'm going to try and get through some of my work on other studies as well. So first I'm going to give you just a bit of background on charter schools because it's never safe to assume that everyone knows an equal amount about what charter schools do and what they are. And also charter schools are different in every state, so it's not the case that if you know your local charter school, you know everything about charter schools in the United States. I'm going to look at who applies and who enrolls in charter schools, and we're going to look at several states there. And then at who teaches in charter schools and how are they rewarded. I think this is a really interesting topic and continues to be. We still have a lot to learn about how charter schools are changing the nature of the teaching profession. Then I'm going to talk briefly about a study of mine that looks at how charter schools affect the regular public schools around them. When a charter school enters, does the local regular public school get worse or does it get better is a very important question because charter schools only enroll a small share of students in the United States. So how they affect the schools around them is a very important question because that's sort of 95% of the students are in those other schools. And then we're going to get to a lot of the meat of the presentation today, which is about how charter schools affect the achievement of the students who actually attend them. And I'm going to be showing you results from New York City, where I'm conducting a study of all of the charter schools in New York City, and then some results from Chicago, where I'm conducting a similar sort of study. And then finally, I'm going to get at a really important question for the long run, which is, can we identify anything about charter schools that makes some of them more successful than others of them? And charter schools vary quite a lot in their policies. We'll see that they vary much more than regular public schools do in some key policies. So if we also see that their performance varies, maybe we can relate the differences in their policies to the differences in their performance. We're going to see that this is pretty preliminary and speculative evidence, but it's nevertheless very interesting and I think provocative. Okay, so what are charter schools? Well, charter schools are somewhere between, they are public schools, but they have some of the characteristics of private schools. And one of the key characteristics that they have in common with private schools is that they're fee-based, so that when a parent takes his or her child to a charter school, there is a fee that follows that child, and if you move your child, the fee also goes with your child. So in that sense, they're sensitive to parental choice financially in the same way that a private school would be. However, the fees are tax financed. They come from the public purse. So in that sense, and in many other senses, charter schools are, in fact, public schools. Their per pupil budget depends on the state. So it's anywhere from about half of the regular public schools around them in some states. In other states, it's up to about 80, 85%. Usually the only time you find charter schools that have a budget that's 100% of the regular public schools around them, it's a charter school that's actually somewhat controlled by the district in which it's located. And it doesn't have as much autonomy. So most of the more autonomous charter schools are going to have a little less money to spend than the regular public schools around them. And they also tend to have less money for infrastructure, buildings, things like that. New York City is an interesting example, but I won't go into it unless someone wants to ask me about it. So charter schools have to obey most public regulations, anything to do with health, safety, non-discrimination, and so on. But what they do control is day-to-day management decisions and curricular decisions. So no one tells a charter school that it can't buy a certain set of textbooks. No one tells a charter school that they can't basically hire who they want to hire within often pretty wide bounds. Some charter schools have to hire certified teachers. Some of them have to hire a certain number of certified teachers on their staff. But most of them, in fact, have quite a lot of freedom in terms of who they hire and how they handle day-to-day management of teachers, which is, of course, probably the single most important thing that a school does. And also how they pay teachers. You don't have to pay your teachers the same way as the regular public school does. Now, because they're public schools, their students take state exams just like regular public schools do on the same days, same exams. That's not any different. And that's going to prove to be very convenient for studying charter schools, because without them taking the state exams, it wouldn't be easy for us to compare them to other schools. They cannot select students up front on the basis of something like tests or interviews or anything else that would look like selective admissions. Instead, if they are oversubscribed, in general, they have to run lotteries. And these lotteries are school by grade by year specific. So what do I mean by that? I mean that if you have George Washington Charter School, it has 25 places in its kindergarten, and it runs a little kindergarten lottery for that year. It doesn't just run a lottery for the whole school. There's a little kindergarten lottery and a first grade lottery and so forth and so on. Okay? So there's a lottery for each year that has places in it. And of interest to those of us, especially who come from a management background or an economics background, they have 4 different types of governance, which resembles more closely that of other nonprofits, including universities and to some extent firms. So the first form of governance is parents. And like a store, or for that matter, a university, if they're not performing well, parents will leave, the consumers will leave, and that is a form of governance, voting with your feet, so to speak. They also have a school board, and the board is appointed to manage the sort of day-to-day oversight of the principal and the people who run the school. And the boards are often appointed, community members might be on it, local education leaders might be on it. Then they're responsible to an authorizer. The authorizer is often a state-appointed group. Sometimes it's part of a university that authorizes charter schools and decides that they can exist. And a charter school has to come back and see its authorizer at intervals. In some states, the interval is 2 years. In other states, it's as long as 5 or 7 years. And when you get reauthorized as a charter school, typically there's a tremendous amount of scrutiny during the reauthorization. And some charter schools are shut down in that process. Some of them are reconstituted. Boards can also reconstitute charter schools. So often a charter school that's not doing terribly well, if you want to think about what happens, the first thing that happens is you start to see parents exit. The next thing that happens is you start to see the board get on the case of the charter school and maybe change the principal or the leadership at the school, maybe change the curriculum. And then the third thing you would see, the third line of defense, is essentially the authorizers, who, if something gets to them, by that point there's a pretty serious problem because the parents and board couldn't change it. And then, of course, all charter schools participate in their state and federal accountability systems because they are public schools like other public schools participate. Okay, so I'm going to focus a lot today. We're going to sort of roam around the United States. We're going to look at some work from Florida, some work from Arizona, some work from New York City, some work from Chicago, and then some nationwide things. But I want to focus quite a lot today on New York City because that's where we're going to look most intensely at their achievement results. So just to give you a sense of what New York City's charter schools are like, New York City has About 60 schools now. In this study, I only have about 50 of them because some of them are new. And they have 3 authorizers in New York State. One of them is the New York City Schools Chancellor himself, Joel Klein. He's actually quite supportive of charter schools in New York City because it gives him leverage on his regular public schools. And there are the Regents of New York State and the State University of New York, and they all authorize charter schools. And they try and maintain the standards for charter schools in New York State. Charter schools also have different types of what are called operating agencies. And I think these are really important because if you were to ask me how will the United States look different in terms of education in 10 or 15 years, I would say that some of these big operating agencies are going to be much more important, and they're going to be household names, like Walmart is a household name. And people are really going to understand what different ones do. So a lot of charter schools are run by charter management organizations or educational management organizations. The difference between them, a charter management organization is, for instance, KIPP Academy. It's a non-profit organization. It runs many charter schools in the United States, and they all have the same, you can think of it as a brand or a franchise or a league of schools. They tend to roll out the same types of policies. They have the same types of human resource policies. They use the same type of curriculum, and so on. And similarly, educational management organizations do that. Edison Schools is a well-known educational management organization. They're very similar to the nonprofits, except technically they're for-profit. I say technically because none of them have ever actually made a profit. So as far as I can tell, there's really no difference between these two. They're all nonprofits, or perhaps negative profits. Okay, and then finally there are community-grown organizations. This is what often people think of when they think of charter schools. These are startups. They grow up from the community. Some of them are mom and pop started. They're started by groups of teachers. They might be started by a local community organization. And those, you can see, account for about half of the students in New York City. But my guess is that in 10 years, in most parts of the United States, these organizations will account for much more than 50% of the charter schools in the United States. Because they can walk in and set up a charter school that looks like a school on day one. Okay, all the classrooms look right, they have all the equipment there, they know how to handle all of the keeping of the books, they know how to handle recording of achievement, they know what diagnostic tests they're going to do, and so on. And so they have a much easier time setting up, getting started, and expanding into new markets. Just to give you a sense of how different some of these charter schools in New York City are, we've tried to divide them into 5 different categories. First, there are child-centered charter schools. You might also think of these as charter schools with a sort of progressive agenda. They are, I think you all know what they are. You would recognize them because you can just read in their mission statements that they say things like, we want every child to bloom. Okay, that would be a classic child-centered mission statement. Then there are the rigorous academic focus schools. These ones, if you were to read their mission statement, it would say something more on the order of every student should go to college, every student should be a high achiever, we want our students to take to be able to take an advanced curriculum in high school. So we'll see that these schools are not actually dealing with kids who are obvious candidates for college, but that's their goal for them. The traditional or general focus schools are tend to have pretty traditional curricula, not progressive curricula. In other words, they use chalk and talk more. They pretty focused, old-fashioned kind of teaching. And their focus is more on making sure that kids graduate from high school and get good jobs, as opposed to saying everyone has to go to college. Then finally, there are some unusual ones, targeted curriculum. For instance, New York City has a marine school that's located in the Port Authority. Why, I don't know, but it is. Okay, so that's an example of a targeted curriculum. They also have art schools. And targeted student demographics, there's an all-boys school, an all-girls school, and a school that's only for high school dropouts. So these sort of actually, this is close to what you would see if you looked at any big charter school community in the United States. There's a range of different types of schools out there, with these 3 types being the dominant types of charter schools in the United States. And they also differ a lot in policies. Now what I've tried to do is pick out the sorts of, in many ways charter schools are like other regular public schools. They do not, you walk into them, they do not look dramatically different. They still have classrooms, although I was in one charter school in This was in Aspen, Colorado, where they had no outside walls. They just were like garage doors that they rolled up on sunny days into the roof, and so there were birds flying through the charter school. So I shouldn't say that they all have classrooms, but most of them are pretty normal in many ways. But there are some policies that they have that are quite different. So I've tried to pick them out. The most obvious ones are the long school day, the long school year, and Saturday school. These are quite popular policies with urban charter schools, like New York City's charter schools. 64% of them have a school year that is at least 2 weeks longer than the typical American school year. And there are some, about half of them have a school year that's 4 weeks longer. And there are some of them that have a school year that is 8 weeks longer than the typical American. In other words, those kids are hardly home at all, okay? A 220-day school year is the longest school year in New York City. And they also, quite a number of them have a long school day of 8 or more hours. So a typical school day in the United States is now about 5.5 hours. So 8 or more hours is a long day. And there are some that have days as long as 10 hours, 7:30 in the morning to 5:30 at night. So these are big changes relative to typical regular public schools. Saturday school, mandatory for at least some of the kids. So kids are going to school typically from 8 a.m. to a little bit after noon on Saturday. And that allows them to have much more English and math each day. So 3 or more hours of English and math each day in elementary school. That's about 54% of them. 100% of the secondary charter schools in New York City have something called a student faculty advisory, which means there's one teacher who is responsible for you throughout secondary school and it's designed to make sure that you don't fall through the cracks. You don't have those in elementary schools because you have your own teacher and you're not moving around during the day. Most of them also do routine internal assessments. So this is somewhat different from regular public schools, which I think tend to avoid frequent assessments. But the idea of most of the charter schools is that having frequent assessments makes each assessment less scary, less of a high-stakes event, and they're more used for diagnosis, less used for, I'm just trying to figure out how well you did at the end of the year, after which point, if you didn't do very well, there's nothing I can do because you're about to go into your summer vacation. So they use routine internal assessments voluntarily. About 50% of them have a parent contract. These parent contracts are completely unenforceable, so it's not a real parent contract. What it is it's a way of establishing expectations with parents. Probably more than 21% of them have a type of discipline we've called no broken windows. It's difficult, though, to assess disciplinary policy. So these were the ones that obviously had this disciplinary policy because the words were sort of written in. So a no broken windows disciplinary policy is quite different from a typical urban school disciplinary policy where what happens is if I do something bad, let's say I kick the kid sitting next to me, really not much of anything happens. And until it escalates where I'm stabbing the kid next to me, in which case I'm sent down someplace else to go talk to the principal or to the vice principal or someone who's going to put me in suspension or something like that. So that would be a fairly typical disciplinary policy where a lot of the harsher discipline is outside of the classroom or delegated to someone else. The no broken windows disciplinary policy is a policy that basically says very small infractions are punished and small things that you do that are good are rewarded with small rewards. So the idea of the no broken windows is that neighborhoods that are successful have no trash on the street, no broken windows. They are neighborhoods where people monitor little things, and the little things add up. Okay? So that's a type of disciplinary policy. Most of them have school uniforms, and about half of them have merit pay for teachers. Okay? But you can still see that there are except a couple of things here. There aren't that many universal things in the charter schools in New York City. So even though some of them have a long school day, about 50% of them do not. Okay? And even though a lot of them have a long school year, almost 35% of them do not. So there is a lot of variation. I'm going to take advantage of that variation later on in this talk. Just to give you a sense of how much growth there's been in charter schools in the United States, in 1992 there were no charter schools in the US. By 2005 we were above 3,500, and now we're closer to 4,000 charter schools in the US. So an enormous growth, but this is still a tiny part of the US school population. Less than 5% of US enrollment is in charter schools. Charter schools are typically not located randomly. They're located in disadvantaged neighborhoods quite disproportionately. And that's not, sometimes it's by policy, but a lot of it's unintentional. They locate where there are parents who are not happy enough with their regular public school that they're willing to try a new school. If you figure that your regular public school is terrific, you're not going to send your child to a startup school that you've never heard of before, where very few of the other neighborhood kids go. So charter schools are disproportionately in areas where people are pretty unhappy with their regular public schools, and that means they're very disproportionately in areas where students are disadvantaged. So if you know New York City very well, you'll recognize that the charter schools in New York City, most of them are located right here. That's Harlem and the South Bronx, two of the poorest areas of New York City. And this is just New York City's comparison, but this would look very much the same if I showed it to you for another state, or if I showed it to you for the United States as a whole. This is the neighborhoods where the charter schools are located, and then on the right are the neighborhoods where, just the average New York City neighborhood. And you can see that the charter schools are located in areas that are about twice as black as the average New York City neighborhood. They're more Hispanic. There are about 10% more of the families are in poverty, so that's a pretty high number. 31% of the families are in poverty. About 40% of the adults are high school dropouts, as opposed to only 28% in the average New York City neighborhood. And about 39% of the children have a single parent, as opposed to about 29% for the average New York City neighborhood. So they're definitely located in disproportionately poor or disadvantaged areas. You can see there are also not very many white or Asian students around them, and that's a characteristic of urban charter schools in the United States. So who attends? Well, as you can guess, since we just looked at the neighborhood, it's probably not going to be a lot of affluent students from very highly educated families. And indeed it is not. So I'm showing you now the whole state of Florida. So these are all of the charter school students in Florida. Florida has a very big charter school population. It's one of the most important charter school states in the United States. And what I'm showing you in red are the characteristics of the charter school students. In green are their prior classmates. In other words, these are the students with whom they would be going to school if the charter school did not exist. Okay? And then in gray, I'm showing you the average Florida public school student. So if we just look at this, you can see that the charter school students in red are more likely to be black than their former classmates. In other words, they are blacker than the schools from which they were drawn. And they are quite a bit more likely to be black than the average Florida student. Hispanic, it's about the same. They're about the same probability of being Hispanic as the average Florida student. The charter school students are more likely to be poor than are the students in the schools from which they were drawn, and also significantly more poor than the average Florida student. And in terms of prior achievement, in other words, how were they doing before they applied to the charter school? Not after they get in, which is going to be a function of what happens in the charter school, but how were they doing before they applied to the charter school? You can see that they were doing worse than their former classmates and worse than the average student in the state of Florida. Okay. The very typical sort of findings is that some people worry about charter schools cream skimming, and I used to say that charter schools do the opposite. And I don't know what the right terminology for that is. It sounds sort of like it would be bottom skimming or bottom skimming. It has something to do with catfish, I'm sure. But there isn't good terminology for it. But they do get disadvantaged students disproportionately. So let's look quickly at New York City and Chicago just to make sure that those weren't anomalous results for Florida. Again, if we look at black, you can see that charter school students are very disproportionately black in New York City, much more so than their former classmates, and much more so than the average New York City student. In fact, you can see that they're more than 2 times as likely to be black as the average student in New York City. If you look at poverty, you can also see that they are poorer than the neighborhoods from which they were drawn, and they're significantly more likely to be poor, almost 20 percentage points more likely to be poor than is the average student in New York City. Special ed, there's not much going on here. They're about equally likely to be in special ed as the average student in New York City. Hispanic and white are sort of interesting. So first of all, there are basically no whites and Asians in charter schools in New York City, and we're going to see that the same thing is true of Chicago. These schools are basically black and Hispanic. Okay, you can forget about whites and Asians. when you're thinking about New York City's and Chicago's charter schools, you just have to think of a world in which there are only blacks and Hispanics. Okay? And so the fact that they are disproportionately black translates into there being a little disproportionately un-Hispanic, because there's just nothing going on here in white and Asian. Okay? So they can't be both more black and more Hispanic. It's impossible, since there's no whites and Asians to disappear. It's only blacks and Hispanics.
Do they offer bilingual and...
They do. And in fact, there's one charter school in New York City which is all, it's a truly bilingual school. It's Spanish, English all day long for everyone, regardless of what background you come from. And they do have to offer, because they're public schools, they have to offer bilingual education, all of the same services that New York City regular public schools have to offer. So they do offer those. And an interesting question is, well, maybe people are less likely to send, maybe Hispanics are less likely to send their kids to the charter schools because they don't offer their materials in Spanish or something like that. But that's not the case. If you look at their materials, they offer them in Spanish, and they offer almost exactly the same materials in Spanish that the regular public schools do. So it's not something that's that simple. And it's either that they have a very disproportionate draw for blacks, which I think is possible, or that they just have more blacks applying, or that Hispanics are more likely to sort of accept whatever is their default school. Would be the right.
Do you have any information on whether the recent immigrants or not? Because Hispanics are more likely to be than the blacks.
Yes,
right?
exactly. No, we do know what their English language background is of their family, which is not the same thing as saying that they're recent immigrants, but is an approximation. And in New York City, they are a little less likely to have a non-English speaking background than the students who attend the regular public schools. But the difference is quite small. So it couldn't account for these big differences. And in Florida, there's really no difference in terms of home language. And in Chicago, there's only a little difference as well. So I think that may be part of the story, but it can't be, it's probably not the whole story. If you were to ask me, my guess is that it actually has something to do with how dissatisfied the parents are, and whether Hispanic parents are a little less dissatisfied than some of the black parents in these areas.
Yeah, because the charter school I'm familiar with was actually all places in Scottsdale, Arizona. All white.
Right. Well, Arizona is an interesting state, and there are also charter schools that are located in rural areas. So, and charter schools located, Alaska has a big population of charter schools that are largely Native American or Native Eskimo schools. So they're all over the place. I mean, there is no such thing as the uniform charter school. And then finally, quickly, if we look at Chicago, you can see it looks very similar to New York City. Charter school students are more likely to be poor. They're more likely to be black, a little less likely to be Hispanic. Hardly any of them are Asian or white, and they're about equally likely to be in special ed. So that's the picture of who's going to these urban charter schools, although I also showed you Florida, where they're everywhere. They're not just in urban areas, they're spread out all over the states. Okay, well, one of the most interesting things about charter schools is that because they are not bound by the typical teacher's contracts, they can have different people who teach, and they can decide to reward them differently. They can hire them differently. They can even make decisions about how to let them go differently or counsel them out differently. That's how since no one really fires teachers, including charter schools, it's just how they counsel them in or out of being at the school. So if you walk into a charter school, the one thing that you will notice immediately in the typical charter school is that they have younger teachers. Now some of that is just a function of the fact that the schools are younger too, so it's natural that they would have younger teachers. But they do have younger teachers, and it may be a way of their having teachers who are more energetic, more motivated, but it may also just be a way of saving money because they have school budgets that are typically smaller than those of regular public schools. So that is a way to save money. If you can get the same quality teacher and pay her a lower salary, that's terrific. And if you think about the regular public schools, they pay teachers pretty much based on seniority and credentials. So if you hire a young, talented teacher in a charter school, and her outside option is teaching in a regular public school where she's going to be at the lowest pay grade, you can afford to pay her quite a lot more than she could earn in the regular public schools, and you still won't be paying your teaching workforce as much as if you had a whole bunch of 15-year veterans in your school. So that's one of the things you'll notice about charter schools is that they have younger teachers. But I did a study where I compared charter schools and regular public schools on a number of qualities of teachers to really find out what charter schools were doing differently. So I've told you about the age difference, but what we might also be interested in are who do they decide to hire in terms of their skills or aptitudes. So as many of you probably know, it turns out to be very difficult to relate a teacher's credentials to how well she actually does in the classroom, because some teachers with perfectly normal average credentials seem to do just as well or better than other teachers. But there are a few things that people tend to look for. One of them is the teacher's aptitude. Another one is how many math and science courses the teacher has taken. This is obviously especially important for math and science teaching. And then finally, I'm going to look at the number of extra instructional hours per week the teacher teaches, sort of as an indication of how invested she is or how willing she is to work extra hours in the school. And you can see that charter school teachers have higher teacher aptitude. So this is based on not praxis tests or something like that, but the selectivity of the college that they went to as an undergraduate. So they basically went to more selective colleges as undergraduates. They're more likely to have taken college science and math courses. I've just shown you science here, but math would look very similar. And they work many more extra instructional hours per week. And this is if you look at that, that's just a really big difference. And basically 4.5 extra, or almost 5 extra instructional hours per week. So that does add up over the course of a school year, and that's an important thing to think about. You know, when you think, what are these charter schools doing? How do they make students have a different experience? But if you're going to ask people to do these things, or if you're going to ask these people to be at your school, you have to reward them, or they're going to eventually leave and go off to some other school, like a regular public school. So the first thing I did was I looked at how much more do you get paid in a charter school if you have a higher aptitude. In other words, you come from a more selective college. Well, the green bar, which you can just barely see, shows that in a regular public school, you basically don't get paid any more for having higher aptitude. Whereas in charter schools, the typical pay increase for a 10 percentile point increase in aptitude is around 8.5%. Okay, so that's non-negligible. They're getting paid more for having higher aptitude. Similarly, if you have more college science courses or math courses, this is just for science, you end up getting paid quite a lot more. And the difference there, in regular public schools, you do get paid a bit more, about 4% more, but you get paid about 9% more in charter schools. And this helps charter schools get over the fact that there are often big vacancies in math and science. So they're actually just paying these people more to come. And then finally, they give them larger increases in pay for working extra instructional hours, and this is per 10 hours a week. So you can see that because they want to attract different types of teachers, they have to reward them differently, and in fact they are. So I think one of the big differences in policies that charter schools are engaging in is they're rearranging the teaching profession, they're rearranging the teaching workforce, making it less based on just credentials and more based on some other characteristics of teachers. So we're going to switch gears again and talk about how charter schools affect the regular public schools around them. As I said, I think this is an extremely important topic because if you really think charter schools are promising, it shouldn't just be because they are a sort of escape hatch for a small number of students who would otherwise have to attend public schools that are failing. What you really hope is that they change the public schools that are failing around them to be better schools, that they influence them either through competition or through being exemplary or being innovative in some way that the regular public schools imitate. But it is not at all obvious that they are going to be able to transform the schools around them in a good way. They could transform them in a bad way. Now, what people worry about, if you just read the newspapers, people worry a lot about cream skimming by the charter schools. And we've sort of seen that it doesn't look like that's going on. So if what you were worried about was that charter schools will cream skim off all the most advantaged high-achieving students, and then the regular public schools around them will be left with only the low-achieving, disadvantaged students, then we can already see that that's probably not going to happen, okay? Because it's just the numbers just aren't there, the data sort of goes the other way. But nevertheless, it's not obvious that you couldn't change the regular public schools in a bad way. For instance, it could be that even though the charter schools have very disadvantaged students and relatively lower achieving students, maybe they have all of the parents who are really motivated, who care a lot, and so when those parents move towards the charter schools, somehow the governance that those parents were creating in the regular public schools will disappear, and the regular public schools will get worse. So what we would like to do, if we want to answer this question, how do they affect the regular public schools around them, is randomly assign charter schools to be in different areas of the United States. We'd like to just have a big, huge helicopter and drop them, you know, around randomly from the helicopter. I could squish a few people, sort of like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, right, the house dropping from the sky. And that would work very well, because then we would get to see what happened to the regular public schools that randomly had a charter school dropped around them. That doesn't happen because charter schools locate where there is demand for them, and they tend to locate in these disadvantaged areas. So the first thing that should be obvious is that what I can't do is I can't just do something simple that says, I'm going to look at your typical regular public school with no charter schools around it, and then I'm going to look at regular public schools that have charter schools around them, and I'll compare the two. That's not going to work, because it's going to turn out that all the regular public schools that have charter schools in their neighborhood are more likely to be disadvantaged, and the regular public schools that have no charter schools around them are typically in affluent suburban neighborhoods. And okay, so we can see that's not an apples to apples comparison. So I have to try and make more of an apples to apples comparison. And what I did to do that is I went to 2 states, Michigan and Arizona. I'm going to show you the results from Arizona, because they have the most, or they had the most charter schools, and charter schools in operation the longest at the time I conducted this study. And in fact, in Arizona now, about 12% of students attend charter schools. So it's a really big charter school state, and they have them spread out all over the state. And there are some regular public schools that face competition from 1 or more charter schools, and where as many as 15 or 20% of their students might be on the verge of going to a charter school. So it's not 1% of the students who might leave, it's more like 15 or 20% of the students who might leave. So that's kind of a good place to look for effects. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pursue something called a differences in trends analysis, where I will look at a charter school entering next to a regular public school. I'll find a regular public school that initially looked a lot like the regular public school that gets the charter school neighbor. Okay? And I'll look at how they were trending before, and then I'll look at how the trends in achievement change after the charter school enters. So this is sort of a schematic to help you understand this. So we have regular public school purple and regular public school green. And you can see that they have very similar achievement trends. I would have deliberately picked them in the study so that they had prior achievement trends and prior levels of achievement that looked very similar. And then at some point in time, a charter school enters, but it enters next to the green school. Okay, so it competes with this green school, and the purple school doesn't have any charter school that comes in to compete with it in its area.
How are you defining competition? Is it
Right.
just like a 5-mile radius, or
what I did was, first of all, I said that I wasn't going to consider the charter school as being competitive until they were getting at least 5% of the enrollment in the district. Okay. And in Arizona, the district is actually the unit of competition. Okay. Arizona has fairly small school districts. It's not a state that has, big county-wide districts or something like that. It has districts that correspond to municipalities, essentially. So a charter school or charter schools had to be getting at least 5% of the enrollment before I said they were really providing competition, because otherwise every little mom and pop operation would be competition. And if the trends go like this afterwards, in other words, the green school ends up having a better trend than the purple school, then I'm going to say that the charter school had a good effect on the regular public schools around it. And so that improves after charter school entry. And conversely, if the green school's trend goes down afterwards relative to the purple school's trend, then I'm going to say that having the charter school enter made the regular public schools do worse. Okay? So I just do this with all of the charter schools in the state of Arizona and the state of Michigan, but that's the basic idea of the study. It's a fairly straightforward study. And I want to say up front, it is not perfect, because the only thing that would be perfect would be, again, to have this helicopter that dropped the charter schools and squished people on the ground. Okay, so here are the results for Arizona's regular public schools. And what we're looking at here, let's just look at the math on the left-hand side. this sort of light gold bar is the annual improvement in math in Arizona's regular public schools that were in the study. So they had to be a lot like the regular public schools that were going to get charter school competition. In other words, we're not really talking about affluent schools here because none of them got much charter school competition. It's disproportionately working class types of schools, not exclusively, but mostly. So you can see that they were improving by about 2 points a year, each year, before the charter schools came in. And then afterwards, they were improving by about 5 points a year in math. So that's a pretty hefty increase in their annual improvement in math. And the improvement in reading is about the same, although their initial level of improvement was smaller. So they were only improving by a little less than 1.5 points a year before the charter schools entered, and then after they were improving by about 4 percentage points a year. The results from Michigan look similar to this, but they're a little less dramatic. So if these were the Michigan bars, what you would see is that instead of the before-after gap being as big as, say, 3 test points a year in annual improvement, it would be more like 1.5. Okay. And similarly for reading, it would be a smaller effect. Now, Arizona charter schools have a lot more autonomy than Michigan charter schools do. So that may be a function of the fact that they're just different schools, but they also are serving different populations. You know, Detroit, Michigan is not Phoenix, Arizona. So it's not necessarily the case that you would expect to get the same effects from charter schools in the 2 different states. I think it's worth saying as well that I consider these to be pretty impressive gains in achievement, not because the one-year gain is big, but because if you were to add it up over a long period of time and say, well, this regular public school is going to improve over a long period of time, it would add up eventually. But we are not in a situation yet where we have very many regular public schools that have been exposed to competition for, say, 20 years. So we have almost none. In fact, I think we have none. It would be impossible. So just mechanically impossible. So we don't know what it would be like to be exposed for competition for 20 years. Okay, now we're sort of getting into the.
Just quickly, you told us that the students who leave are the less good students. So we would expect the ones who stayed to reflect the school to reflect a steeper trajectory north. So how do you control for that?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And in fact, it gets at a very deep question in education. So let me answer it, and then I'll tell you why it gets at a deep question. So the students who leave the regular public schools for the charter schools do tend to be lower achieving in the beginning. So that should, in the first year that they leave, that should raise the regular public schools performance just because some low achieving kids have left and therefore they're not contributing anymore to the average level of achievement. However, it wouldn't account for continued gains. Once they've left, they're gone and something else has to be causing different gains. So now we get into a very deep question of whether students who are low achievers in the United States have low achievement levels or have low rates of gain in student achievement. Now, that sounds like kind of a techie kind of issue, and it is. It turns out that we don't know the answer to that question. You might think that the answer to that question was obvious, but actually if you look at a lot of data, students who start off with low achievement often have higher rates of gain. And so we don't actually have a very clear sense of whether when you remove low achievers, should you just expect a one-time effect on the regular public schools, or should you expect that their whole rate of achievement will go up afterwards? So what we can do is you can just take out the one-time effect of having the lower achieving students removed. And in Arizona, that would, if I were to take them out, it would take off a tiny little sliver off each one of these. And the reason it would take off only a small sliver is that there just aren't that many students leaving. So, you know, a school that faces a lot of competition would lose maybe 5% of its students. It is true that they're drawn disproportionately from the lower part of the distribution, but they're not all the lowest achieving students. It isn't the whole bottom 5% that leaves. So therefore, losing 5% of students who are less, well, high achieving, then it just doesn't add up to that much in the way of numbers.
Do you have any information on whether the kids with disciplinary problems before?
We
disrupted in the classroom?
Not. We could potentially get it in New York City, but let me tell you what the difficulty with that is. Most kids who get actually recorded in administrative data as disciplinary problems are in upper grades. We're talking 8th grade, 9th grade. That's because when you're a little kid and you're a disciplinary problem, you just aren't that big a problem. Okay. I have a story about that, but I will leave it. Yeah, so you just aren't that big a problem, so you don't tend to show up in administrative records. And charter schools, I haven't mentioned this before, but most charter school applicants are little kids. Most parents move their kids into these schools when they're kindergartners, first graders, etc. There's quite a lot of also moving kids in at the end of elementary school, so that might be 5th grade or 6th grade or 7th grade, depending on the area of the United States. But there are not a lot of them who move in the grades where we would have expected to see a disciplinary record if they were disciplinary problems. So if I'm looking at a bunch of kindergartners and first graders, the probability that they would show up as having a disciplinary problem, even if they did, is really, really small. Okay, so the answer is we don't know.
In education, people look at a lot of peer effects,
right,
which would suggest that if you remove even some fraction of the lower achievers, the rest would
that
do
might
better.
happen.
So
yes.
the continued success. So you'd expect more than a one-time.
Right. So, but the interesting thing is then, of course, what you expect to see in the charter schools is kind of the mirror image of that, right? If we've just taken all the disciplinary problems out of the regular public schools and put them all together, we would expect that to depress the achievement of charter schools. So
depends why they're disciplinary.
yes, I suppose so. Yes, so it would be better dealt with by the charter schools. But I do work on peer effects myself, so I'm very interested in the topic. But I don't think we have as good a handle on the peer effects to say, oh, I can tell you what I would expect from this. In fact, my own work on peer effects shows that the so-called bad apple model, in which you have one student who's a bad apple in the classroom and he spoils the whole barrel, that doesn't receive a lot of empirical support. So it is the case that there are peer effects that you can pick out clearly in the data, but extreme peer effects don't show up very much in the data.
I was slightly curious, I mean, back to Mark's question though, why are you looking at it strictly as sort of a one-time event? Doesn't it continue to occur? Aren't more charters opening? If it is, feeding off of the lower achieving students, doesn't that keep happening over time?
Sometimes, but an interesting thing is that it tends to stabilize. And the reason it tends to stabilize is precisely this. Okay, so if you have a regular public school, it's not doing very well. Parents are not very happy. 10% of its kids leave, or 8% of its kids leave. And the regular public school improves because it now faces competition from the charter school. Kids stop leaving. So we do not really, I suppose there may be a regular public school in the United States that got wiped out by a neighboring charter school, but I think there are none. Okay? So that tells you that most of them stabilize at a level where they might have lost 12% of their kids, 10% of their kids, but it might start that they lose 5, and then another 3% pretty quickly, and then it would be 1%, 1/2 of 1%. As they improve, their enrollment will start to stabilize. They won't keep losing students.
You expect some kind of convergence as well, because if you start out really low, it's easy to pick up 3, 4, 5 points, but if you're doing really well, it's going to be really tough to squeeze out another 3 or 4 points, right?
No, that's true.
So the base matters.
Yeah. But this is also, I wasn't saying their improvement stops. I was saying that their enrollment losses stop.
Yeah.
Right? Their enrollment losses gradually slow down. And that's just because once they've improved enough, their enrollment losses just gradually taper off. And that's a pattern we've seen in the United States. It doesn't have to be that way. I'm just saying that's the way it is in general. Okay, so now we're going to turn to how the charter schools affect the achievement of the students who attend them. And here, it's much easier to do a really good empirical study, because of those lotteries that we talked about in the beginning. And the lotteries are going to allow me to do what is essentially a random design, a scientific design, where the students who are lotteried in will be compared to the students who are lotteried out. And the only difference between these two types of students will be that they participated in the lottery and some won and some did not win the lottery. But it's going to turn out that they look just identical, these two groups, the lotteried in and the lotteried out. They look identical in everything we can observe. And we think that they're also identical on motivation and so on because they both applied to go to the charter school. So the only difference between them is just this one.
Could win the lottery and go to kindergarten. at the charter school. The next year they lose the lottery and they go back to the regular public
No,
school.
once you've won, you're in.
You're in, okay.
You're in until the end of that school. So, for instance, in New York City, they have charter elementary schools, charter middle schools, and some charter high schools. If you win the lottery for a charter elementary school, you stay in until that school ends, but you would have to re-participate in a lottery to get into a charter middle school, and you might not. You might go back to the regular public schools.
But if there's an opening in the 5th grade, because kids moved away or something, there'd be a lottery to fill up the
Yes,
class.
exactly.
Yeah.
So in a typical charter school, what you'll see is a big lottery in kindergarten. Okay, so they might have 50 places in kindergarten or 65 places in kindergarten. And then they'll have a few places in the other grades as they fill up from kids having left, having moved, so forth and so on. But a typical 4th grade would only have 2 or 3 places available in the lottery. So I'm going to show you the results from my lottery-based study of New York City, and my study of Chicago's charter schools basically has exactly the same nature. So I'll just show you the results after we've sort of gone through the New York City example more carefully so that you don't have to see everything twice. So we're just comparing the achievement of the lotteried in and lotteried out students, and the achievement data that I'm looking at today is from 2000 to 2006. We have 2 more years of data now, but we haven't incorporated it in the results you're looking at today. I'm first going to check that the lotteries were actually random. They appear to be random. I mean, they hold them in public, but I suppose they could be cheating in some way. But we're going to see that they look random. Then we're going to check matching, and I'll just tell you that when I get there what that means. And finally, we're going to check for attrition, and we'll see that the data are actually very high quality. So it looks like a very high quality experiment for trying to figure out what the charter schools do. This is for those in the room who are interested in empirical methodology, and those who are not can just shut their ears or take a short vacation, eat your sandwich, and so on. Okay. So it's important to understand that the randomization is at the lottery level. In other words, it's the George Washington School kindergarten lottery for the year 2004. So there are 725 little lotteries in my New York City study, and in Chicago I have something like 300 and some lotteries. Each one is a little lottery. So there has to be a lottery fixed effect in for each lottery. Because it's not random to which school you apply, it's random whether you're in or out in that particular lottery. The treatment is going to be considered the time that you're enrolled in charter school. So what I'm going to do is estimate an effect of having been in the charter school for 1 year, an annual effect. And that actually means that I'm constraining the effect a little bit so that if the 1-year effect, the first year being in charter school was great, okay, and the second year was not so great, the second year you didn't get much additional benefit, I'm going to estimate an average over those 2 years, okay? So that's, it turns out that that's what the data looks like anyway. It doesn't look like there's a big surge in the first year and then a plateau in later years, but I am showing you the average effect of being in a charter school for a year. And in the sort of treatment effects methodology, you can think of the intention to treat as the time elapsed since I was admitted to the charter school in a lottery. Okay, so if I was admitted to start going to the charter school in September of 2003, and I don't actually show up there until January of 2004, the intention to treat variable is going to start ticking the moment I could be in the charter school. Okay? Now, the reason that that matters for those who are interested is that I'm going to be estimating the treatment of being in a charter school, but if I decide not to show up, that's not random. The only random thing is that lottery. Okay? So I need to instrument for the treatment of being in the charter school with the fact that I won the lottery. Again, this is all for those of you, keep your ears closed if you're not interested in treatment effects methodology. Also, all of the effects I estimate today are going to be local to the compliers. And in New York City, and also the students who are like the applicants. So what I mean by this is you should not extrapolate any of these findings to affluent kids in suburban neighborhoods who would refuse to go to a charter school if they were offered a position. Because we don't know anything about the outcomes for students like that. The only kids about whom we're going to learn something are kids who are somewhat like the kids who actually went to these charter schools, and also whose parents actually wanted them to go to the charter schools. Now, I think that's fine, because I'm not really all that interested in what would happen to a child who went to a charter school whose parents would, no, he's not going. So we're going to learn about charter schools' effects on the sorts of kids who go there. And finally, in New York City and in Chicago, there are no defiers. A defier would be somebody who is lotteried out, but who somehow manages to get into a charter school anyway, and we do not see any of those in the data. Okay, a little bit more empirical methodology, and then I will stop. I mainly show results for balanced lotteries. This is lotteries where it really looks like the lottery was big enough to have a balanced lotteried in and lotteried out group. They look similar to one another. And the reason that some lotteries are unbalanced is they could be very small. So if I'm lotterying off just one school place, I might have 30 kids lotteried out and only one lotteried in, and it could be that the one who's lotteried in just happens to look different than the ones who are lotteried out. Okay. There are some students who apply to multiple charter schools, and we have to put them in sort of special little lotteries that I won't go into, but if you're interested, I can give you the details. And similarly for siblings, siblings are kind of lotteried in as a group. That's standard in the United States. My older sibling gets lotteried in, I'm lotteried in too. And there are robust standard errors. Okay, so we're done with the empirical methodology. So were the lotteries random? Well, if we look at the characteristics of the students who are lotteried in and lotteried out, it looks like they're exactly the same. You can see their none of these are statistically significant differences, and they just look the same. Their prior math scores, their prior reading scores, the percent of special education, percent who are black, the percent who are poor, basically looks like they were, in fact, conducting random lotteries, which is what they were supposed to do. So that's nice. You can go forward. We're trying to match. What we do is we get all the lottery information from the charter schools, and then we match it into the New York City public school database. And we need to match about 90% of the kids, not more than 90, because about 10% of the kids would be drawn from private schools. So they shouldn't actually be in the New York City database. And we achieved a match rate that was almost exactly what we wanted to achieve. In other words, every kid who was drawn from the New York City public schools, we were basically able to match them back to their New York City public school records. So we felt that we did really well on that. So that thing should be pretty reliable. And the students who we matched, the few students who we didn't match, really look just like the students who we did match. So it's not the case that somehow the students who weren't showing up in the New York City database are just very different and we're not taking account of them. They all, in fact, look very similar. Okay, so this is previously in a pre-K program, previously in homeschool, previously in private school, previously in public school, percent female, percent black, percent white, percent Hispanic, percent non-native English.
But Caroline, shouldn't the unmatched look different from the matched if they predominantly were coming from private schools previously?
If you think about the classic private school, yes, right? I mean, the private school that we all have in our heads, which is somewhat elite. But New York City has a lot of private schools, especially private school kindergartens and first grades, where a lot of them would be drawn from these private school kindergartens. And they're located in very non-affluent areas. They mainly serve disadvantaged kids. And most of them have been created by, well, sort of local charities. So that most of the kids who are drawn from private schools in New York City are not even just drawn from the classic Catholic private schools, and certainly not drawn from elite private schools. They're drawn from these little community private kindergartens that show up all over New York City. I didn't realize that this was a big phenomenon in New York City until I did the study, but it turns out that it is. So they do, but they just don't look different. Actually, the difference in black is statistically significant, but it's less than 1/2 of a percentage point. So, and we've got, the study includes 97% of the students who've ever attended a New York City charter school. So we did lose just a few, but we have about 13,000 students. And we have hardly any attrition from this study, only about 1/7 of 1%. And as far as I can tell, maybe that's just because New York City is such an absurdly large school district, and no matter how far you try to move in the South Bronx or someplace else, you're still trapped in the New York City school district. One way to think about how big it is that if Joel Klein were to go around and visit each one of his schools each day, he would not get around to all of his schools in 4.5 years. Right? And it's just one school district. Okay, so we're going to measure achievement with the New York State tests. And we're using standard scores, which just means I'm expressing things in standard deviations. If you don't like standard deviations, it's about a performance level in reading and about 1.3 performance levels in math. So in other words, you're going from like the top of the failing category to the bottom of the proficient category if you go up one standard deviation. So that's a big distance. That would be closing the whole gap between disadvantaged kids and non-disadvantaged kids. We also are looking at students who are in high school in the charter schools in both Chicago and New York City, but we really don't have very many results for them yet. And that's because if most kids enter as kindergartners and first graders, as you can imagine, we just don't have enough kids who've gotten up into those grades yet. So we've got results for them, but none of them are interesting enough to show. For those who are interested in the official estimating equations, here they are. I'm going to go right past them. Okay. And this table is not for you to read, because you can't possibly read all those little numbers. It's to show you that we did try out a lot of different specifications. Okay? So our basic specification just says, here are the lotteried in kids, here are the lotteried out kids. Let's compare them after 1 year, after 2 years, after 3 years. It's very simple. Okay? There's nothing special going on. But then we do try and control for other things, like we see what happens if we control for the race and gender and so forth of the kids. We control for their prior test scores. We control for whether they were poor, whether they were English language learners. We reweight for attrition. We do all kinds of the sort of standard things that you do to show that your results are robust. In other words, that they aren't going to change a lot if you make small changes in the sort of estimates that you come up with. And of course, they're not going to change very much because of the randomization. The randomization guaranteed that we had the lotteried in and the lotteried out were very similar to begin with, so controlling for other things in the background is really not going to make very much difference.
I can agree that she was.
Yeah.
Are you controlling only for student characteristics or also school characteristics?
So far we're not controlling for school characteristics, we're only controlling for the student characteristics. But I will show you in a minute that the schools differ in terms of student achievement, and then we'll look at the relationship between that and school characteristics. So those are the results for math, which I said I didn't expect you to read. Those are the results for reading. So that's just to sort of show you that we have gone through this process of trying to make sure that our results were really not sensitive to small changes. What are the results? The New York City charter schools raise student achievement each year, so these are each year effects, by between 0.06 and 0.11 standard deviations, where our preferred estimate is 0.1 of a standard deviation in math. Okay. And in reading, the per year effect is between 0.04 and 0.07, and our preferred estimate is actually 0.04. Okay, but that's sort of the range. Now, what does this mean? Okay, because that seems like, I told you a standard deviation was very big. One way to think about it is that it would take me about 10 years in the typical charter school to entirely make up the distance between failing and proficient in math. Okay? Because each year I get about 1/10 of a standard deviation, so if I spent 10 years there, I should, in theory, get all the way from failing to proficient. Okay? And in reading, it's going to be somewhat less than that, depending on which one of these numbers I choose, but it still would take me more than 10 years to make up this whole gap. So depending on whether you work a lot in education, if you are a normal lay person who doesn't spend lots of your time looking at education data, you think these effects are small. In fact, all the charter schools were sure in New York City that they would have much bigger effects. But I work with education data all the time, so I think these effects are huge. And in fact, if they'd been much bigger, I would have been worried. So just for context, you all have probably heard about the Tennessee class size experiment, where they reduced class size in Tennessee. When they reduce class size, and those sort of give you the most optimistic estimates about what class size reductions do. When they reduced class size by 10% in that experiment, they got an effect on student achievement that was between 1/2 and 1/5 as large as these effects. And they only got it once. So even if you stayed in a small class through the entirety of elementary school, you would only get about 0.02 standard deviations for a 10% reduction in class size. Okay, so these are big effects by the standards of people who do education research. Okay? And as I say, they allow you to close the gap in math if you stay long enough in the charter schools, and some not. Turns out that the effects are the same for boys and girls. Those are the blues are the boys, of course, and the pinks are the females. Sorry to be so. And then they're about the same for blacks and Hispanics. Looks like there's a little bit of difference, but it's not statistically significant. So it looks like just about everyone gets the same charter school effect. And we see pretty similar effects from the Chicago charter school study, which is very, very similar to the New York study, except that it's on Chicago charter schools. The math effect in Chicago is about 0.15 of a standard deviation per year. And in reading, it's about 0.15 of a standard deviation as well. So somewhat bigger effects than the New York City charter schools effects. We can talk about that if anyone's interested in why I think that is at the end of the talk, because I do have some opinions on this, but for right now, they're just in the same ballpark of effects. An interesting difference between New York City and Chicago is that in Chicago, some of the charter schools have been around a lot longer than they have in New York City. So one of the things you can try and look at more carefully is, what are the effects for kids who've been in charter schools a long time, a short time, who entered as kindergartners, who entered as fifth graders, and so forth and so on. You can't pull all that out of the New York City experiment, but you can with Chicago. So an interesting thing in Chicago is that it appears that if you entered the charter school at a younger age, in an earlier grade, the effects for you are better. So what I've shown here are, these are the blue bars are the effects for children who enter the charter school in kindergarten or grade 1. The red bars are the effects for students who enter the charter school in grades 2 or 3. And the yellow bars, which are always the smallest, are for those who enter the charter schools in grades 4 or 5. Okay? So you can either think of this as being about the fact that when you enter charter school as a kindergartner, you kind of get the whole culture right from the get-go, but you haven't developed any bad habits that the charter school has to get rid of. Or you can think of the idea that when a student enters a charter school in grade 4 or 5, probably there's something already pretty wrong. Okay? Because parents don't just pull their kid out of a normal public school and send them to a charter school in grades 4 or 5 unless there's something already perhaps not going right with that child. Okay, now I'm getting to what I consider to be one of the most fun and speculative parts of this talk, and that is trying to relate the differences among charter schools to the differences in what they do, because we saw at the beginning that they have quite different policies. So different charter schools have different effects. These are the math effects for New York City's charter schools, and all I've done is I've smoothed them. So let me tell you what this graph shows, just so that you have a sense. Up here, there are some charter schools that are raising student achievement by 0.4 of a standard deviation each year. That means that they would get you all the way from failing to proficient in about 2.5 years. Okay, amazing, right? So these schools, I know which ones they are, but I'm not allowed to tell you. Not even whisper in your ear. These schools are raising student achievement by really a pretty astounding amount. Then there are a big lump of schools that are raising student achievement by about 0.2 of a standard deviation per year. That would mean it would take you about 5 years to get from failing to proficient. Then we have another little lump of schools who are raising student achievement by a little less than 0.1. And then finally there are some that have negative effects on student achievement. They don't tend to be big negative effects, but they definitely are. There's a little lump of them down there that have negative effects, right? So that 0.1 that we saw was just an average over all of these different types of effects. Okay? Well, one would like to ask, why is it that some charter schools are way up here doing, apparently achieving amazing effects on kids, and others are down here achieving moderate or even slightly negative effects on students in New York City? So what I'm going to try and do now is relate which schools have more positive effects to the policies that they have. And I want to be clear for everyone in the room that I'm not claiming that what I'm going to show you here are causal effects. These are correlations. And that's because we didn't force some charter schools to have good policies and other charter schools to have bad policies, or randomly assign policies to charter schools. Charter schools get to choose their own policies. Okay? So it could be that I'm just looking at associations, and I'm not really looking at causation. I just want to be very clear. These are associations. So for instance, let me give you an example of what might go the wrong way in terms of causality. Let's say my charter school is doing really badly. It's going down the tubes. And my board says, you've just got to do something about your leadership. Your leadership just isn't working. So let's hire an additional leader. Well, one of the things that varies among charter schools is how many school leaders they have. Some have 1, some have 2, sort of like a COO and a principal, okay, who are different people. Well, it might be that the ones with 2 do worse, and that has nothing to do with the fact that having 2 people makes your school worse. It could be that those were the ones that were struggling, so they got a second leader. Okay? So the causality could go the wrong way. So I just want to warn you that we're going to be looking at correlations here. And this is a multivariate analysis, so everything is being considered simultaneously as policies. So here what we're looking at is just correlations with achievement effects. And on this table, I'm showing you the ones that are interesting. And then I'll show you the ones in a moment that are not interesting. So the thing that really makes a big difference is the number of days in the school year. And this has a big effect. If you increase the number of days in the school year by 10, which is completely normal in the New York City charter schools, you improve student achievement by 0.2 of a standard deviation, which is very big. Okay? So the difference between a school year, a school that has a school year of 180 days, which is the regular length, and a school year of 200 days, that's 20 days, and that almost completely explains the top performing charter schools in New York City.
You know, it occurs to me that the length of the school year ought to include Saturdays then. Do you account for, I mean, I see you have a category of Saturday school, but the number of days, who cares whether they're Saturdays or Sundays or?
Right. So it does not, the number of days in the school year does not include the Saturdays.
Yeah, that's
okay?
what I'm asking.
In part because usually not everyone has to go to Saturday school.
Okay.
So in a typical charter school, if you were the highest achieving kid, you might be able to avoid going to Saturday school. That depends a bit on the charter school. You can always go to Saturday school, but some kids need not in some charter schools. And I want to also say that really, if you look at the top 4 characteristics here, these are all related. These are not that separable from one another. It's not the case that we have some schools that have long school years, but they have short school days. Okay? In fact, what we see are packages. So we tend to see the package, long school year, long school day, Saturday school, and I have to pay for all of this additional time. So how do I do it? Charter schools tend to raise class size. So they'll have larger class size, but long days, Saturday school, and long school years. Okay, and that is a package that stays together. So for those of you who think of this in technical terms, that's a multicollinearity problem because they tend to be packaged together, these policies. So in fact, although I'm identifying it with a long school year, it's that whole package that seems to be associated with good achievement effects. The number of school leaders also seems to have a positive effect on student achievement, or a positive correlation with student achievement. Then there are 2 curricula that have negative correlations with student achievement. I won't emphasize these much because I don't want to get in trouble with the people who publish everyday math and open court reading. But, but they appear to have a negative correlation with student achievement. So, but the big takeaway is this sort of package of, I increase class size, that allows me to save quite a lot of money, because a 10% increase in class size basically saves you 10%. Okay, so that's only about 2 students. You raise class size from 20 to 22, or from 20 to 24, you now are playing around with 10% of your budget or 20% of your budget. You use that to make your school year longer, make your school day longer, and so on. There are some things that weren't correlated with achievement effects that I expected to be correlated with achievement effects, such as the number of years that the school has been in operation, or maybe the type of operating agency. I saw nothing with the type of operating agency, and really nothing also with the number of years that the school has been in operation. And that's because if you look at the schools that have been in operation longer, they seem to adopt the policies that are more successful policies as they get older. So it's not an effect of being in operation a lot of years, it's an effect of the policies that you have. And then there are some policies that we just can't learn anything about because nearly all of the New York City charter schools have them. School uniforms, routine internal assessment, student advisories, and lack of teachers' unions. And so if what you wanted to learn about was, do they do better because they have school uniforms, you can't learn because they all have school uniforms, essentially. All right, so this is basically the end of the talk. Just summing up, charter schools are certainly different. They're not just the same as regular public schools. They deal with students who are unusual. They use their autonomy to pursue different policies. They don't do exactly what regular public schools do. But at the same time, they don't do anything that's very weird, if you think about it. I didn't tell you that they did some bizarre technology thing, that they had kids with computers on their heads, you know, with wires coming out or something like that. It was all sort of sensible stuff that you could do in any school. None of these things were weird or rocket science or things you'd never heard of before. Okay? And we do think they're affecting American education. They certainly improved the achievement of the students in New York City and Chicago, and I've also done some other studies that are more national, but I'm less confident about the results because they're not lottery-based studies, so I'm confident about New York City and Chicago that they're improving those kids' achievement. They do have a different model of teaching that's pretty clear, and I'm not the only person who's done studies of that. They just treat teachers differently. And they affect the regular public schools around them, and I would argue it looks like the evidence is that they have a positive effect, but that's not going to be, it shouldn't convince everyone because there's no way for that sort of evidence to be incredibly strong. So the thing that I take away from this is that if what you thought was happening was that charter schools just did something very different, they had a little silver bullet, you know, and they did this with kids, and that's how they achieved achievement effects, that's just wrong. They appear to do, you know, policies that we've always heard about, and could always have increased the length of the school year. That's not too sophisticated. But, so that's just probably not the right model thinking about what they're doing right. And so, but there's a good side to this, and that is that nothing that we talked about today that they do differently is something that a regular public school could not do, right? There's no law against regular public schools having a long school day or having a longer school year, or deciding that they're going to have a different number of school leaders, or something else. They don't do these things, but that doesn't mean that they cannot do these things. So when we think about what might they learn from charter schools, and why is it that they're not doing some of these things, or they've resisted doing some of these things over time, you probably want to look at other sources of resistance. It's not the law, it's not a regulation, it's politics or other things cause resistance and cause them to not be like the charter schools. But I feel like I've learned a lot from examining charter schools, and I do think actually they are important parts of school reform in the United States because they're somewhat innovative.
You made the point earlier that the teachers in charter schools are different. I'm a science guy, so
Right.
I heard you mention that these teachers are of a higher quality potentially because they have more science background. Do you have any data to support that because the teachers in charter schools are different, the kids do better?
So what we do now to try and figure out whether a teacher is successful is estimate teacher fixed effects, basically, where we try and parse out what that particular teacher's value added is by looking at how well students are achieving when they come in and then comparing it on when they go out and doing that systematically. That's how we estimate teacher fixed effects. So far, the people who've been estimating teacher fixed effects have not done it on any charter school. So I can do it on my Chicago charter schools, but I can't on my New York City charter schools because I don't have the data from the teachers. And you can barely see that there is a relationship between the selectivity of their college and their teacher fixed effect in the charter schools in Chicago. There's also a very big study of New York City, period, regular public schools. In fact, there are two of them, one by Susanna Loeb and some co-authors, and the other one by Jonah Rokoff and some co-authors. And they look at teacher fixed effects in New York City's regular public schools, and then they try and relate those to teacher characteristics. And there's a small effect of coming from a more selective college, but they don't know how many math and science courses a teacher has taken, so they don't, that particular thing they don't know about.
You mentioned that who runs the school doesn't matter. Did you look at who charters the school? Because you mentioned New York, there are different chartering agencies.
In New York, it doesn't matter at all. But actually, I wouldn't say that's probably true of most other states. New York, it just happens to be that the three authorizers are very similar. They work together a lot. They share a lot of information. So they don't really have different philosophies.
Okay, because in banking, you can get either a state charter or a federal charter, and there is a lot of difference between the two.
And in, let me give you an example of a state where they're very different. So in California, you can be chartered by a state charter agency, which tends to look for high quality charter schools. And then, or you can be chartered by your own district. And the districts tend to want to charter schools that they think are going to take students they really don't want off their hands. Okay, so you will see very different charter schools in California depending on who charters.
How does the school select from whom to receive the charter?
Well, in California, they've all wised up and know they all
What about in New York? But in New York?
In New York, it's pretty random in New York. It really is random in New York City. They're all pretty good charter authorities, in my opinion, in New York. The ones that get chartered by Joel Klein himself, by the chancellor, you might think would have an advantage, but he actually treats all of the charter schools very similarly. An interesting thing in both Chicago and New York is that these charter schools do not face big battles with the regular public school district in which they are located, and that's because they both have superintendents. One is called a CEO, one's called a chancellor, but they're two district superintendents who want the charter schools to be there. not so much because they love charter schools, but because they feel that the charter schools give them leverage on their regular public schools. That if a charter school is succeeding in a depressed neighborhood, and the regular public schools are not, then they can turn around and go to the regular public school and say, you guys should be able to do as well as they're doing. And so they are pretty supportive of the charter schools.
I don't want to hog all the question time, but one more question. It seems like it'd be really hard to start a charter school. Do charter schools have a champion that kind of leads the way and stands behind them, maybe offers some financial support? And that could be one thing that explains different successes.
Right.
Who's behind it?
So it is hard to start a charter school. There are some agencies that give advice in most states. In New York City, there's something called the New York City Center for Charter School Excellence. In Chicago, there's a sort of umbrella organization that tries to help them get started. But in some states, there really would not be very much advice for a budding charter school. The charter management organizations and EMOs, the educational management organizations, really know how to do this at this point. They know how to walk in, open up a charter school, and get the whole thing up and running pretty quickly. For community-grown organization schools, it's not so obvious. Some of them will be an outgrowth of, say, a local charity that has never had any experience running a school before, and they'll actually get off to a pretty bumpy start relative to these schools that are run
But
by
even for an EMO, there has to be somebody who goes to them, finds out about them, goes to them, says, we want you to help us.
No, they're pretty aggressive about finding places where they think where they think there's a market.
So, how do you explain New York or the District of Columbia, which seems to have a very different charter reality? In that the public schools really are emptying out
Yes.
into the charters.
Right.
Public schools will be closed down as a result.
Yes.
And if you believe the Schneider and Buckley study, the charter schools in the aggregate aren't improving the education of the students.
Right. So, now I'm going to say something that will, I hope, offend no one in this room, but I don't actually believe in most studies that are of charter schools that are not based on randomization. And the reason I say that is that when I look at my randomized data and I apply other methods to it that are not based on sort of high quality randomized methods, you get different results. And we know that randomization is basically the gold standard here. So if I can produce all kinds of different results by not using the gold standard method, I just don't know what to think about other studies. So I'm not going to conclude anything about the Schneider and Buckley study about Washington, D.C. However, I will say about D.C., I think D.C. is uniquely dysfunctional. And it is, the fact that there is a district like Washington, D.C. in the United States is not that surprising. It has different politics than most other cities, as we know. It has sort of special politics. And it really is a notoriously bad school district. So it doesn't particularly surprise me that in Washington, D.C., the response might be that the regular public schools just empty into the charter schools, and in the end, you'll have a city that just does not have very much of a regular public school population anymore. But I also think that if you look at most other cities, they did not have so much dysfunction in the first place, so they probably have more ability to respond positively to charter schools. I mean, New York City is a great example. It's hardly some amazing district that has no problems. It definitely has schools that really struggle. But they have enough resources within the Department of Education to, when they need to turn around a school and they have an idea how to do it and so forth and so on, they're able to improve quite a lot of schools. So I do think there's a difference in the ability to respond.
Carol, this is really interesting stuff. Let me tell you what I find really interesting and reassuring, but what I also find a little puzzling. This is the first rigorous study I've seen, even with the caveat that what you have there at the end is correlational, about the effect of the longer school day, school year, and so on. It certainly resonates with heuristic evidence that I've seen in the field and so on, for why some of these charter schools do so well. The puzzle is on the competitive effects. The presence of a charter school that, let's say for sake of argument, is having a longer school day and so on, the effect of that in improving the neighboring regular schools, what are they doing? Because it really is, I think, in many of these states, certainly, I can't remember whether your competitive effects were on Florida or New York.
Arizona.
Oh, it was Arizona. Okay, so maybe that's the answer. Maybe in Arizona things. I mean, if you used to tell me it was New York, I just, you know.
In New York, there isn't enough action.
Yeah, and I think it would be very difficult for them to, for the regular schools to respond by increasing the school day. They've got very, you know, work to rule kinds of contracts that would make that virtually impossible. I mean, it's also very expensive. I mean, for example, in Massachusetts, where they now are trying to increase the school day in a small number of regular public school districts at a cost of $1,300 a student, you know, to expand that very far is very expensive.
Right.
So, do you see anything? Is it just Arizona? Do you see anything in Arizona about what they're doing to respond to these schools?
Let me say a couple of things about this, because that is a very interesting question. The first thing to remind you is that they do the longer school day and school year in the same budget. In fact, they have a smaller budget.
Right.
Right.
Yes, they do.
Right.
They do it by
In the charters.
In the charters.
Yes, I know.
They do it by raising class size. So they're not, you know, Massachusetts is not pursuing the same policy. Massachusetts is saying, let's keep class size the same size, and let's do all these things too, and that's why it's expensive.
Sure.
But it may be that if those class size reductions weren't really paying off very much, you could get rid of a few of them, and you would have more money to do longer school day, school year. I also agree with you.
But again, in a union contract, you...
No, in a union contract, it would be hard to respond. I don't think that there are, there may be a few regular public schools in Arizona or Michigan that have responded with a long school day and long school year. It's certainly not totally unheard of, but it's very rare. What I think is the first thing that regular public schools tend to do to respond to competition is they tend to improve their teaching workforce. And I don't mean they do this by some sort of sophisticated thing, like they send them all back to super duper professional development, or they go and hire completely different types of people. They basically get rid of their worst teachers. So, you know, every principal out there knows that he has some real duds in his or her school. And it's hard to get rid of those teachers. I mean, that's just a hard thing to do. It's politically unpopular, make people unhappy, so forth and so on. It's much easier to do if you say, we are losing students to the charter school down the road, and we must do something to respond. And basically, we all know that Mrs. Smith doesn't show up a lot of the time, is, you know, this, she's this, everyone's kind of thinks, yeah, that's true. And it gives them the leverage, I think, to do things like that. It also gives them the leverage to make probably some pretty basic changes in instructional methods and curriculum that they would have wanted to make before. You know, you ask Joel Klein or school principals in Florida why they like having charter schools around them, they'll say, well, I wanted to do X, Y, and Z for years. And I couldn't do those things because it was so hard, and I couldn't negotiate with the teachers, and it wasn't popular with this, and there were these entrenched forces. But then when there was the charter school, people started to feel anxious, and so then you get to actually change things, because it's precisely because they create this sense of, well, we have to do something to respond to the competition. So most of the things they're doing, I'm guessing, are not terribly dramatic things. If you ask them what they did, it would be pretty straightforward kinds of stuff.
Okay, we have to, oh, Sandy, do you have a quick question?
Right, I wondered if you had any data on turnover for teachers in charter schools as opposed to public schools, which is one of the big issues.
Certainly, the teachers are much younger in charter schools, period. So we would expect them to have higher turnover because younger teachers just do have higher turnover. And also, I think the charter schools model, at least for the charter schools I know best, is a model in which they say, we will hire younger teachers, they will be less experienced, they will work very, very hard here for however many years they stay. We think we get more talented people, and it's true that they will leave after. We are not trying to end up with a whole big team of 15-year veterans. So I think it's actually part of their model to have somewhat higher turnover in perpetuity than regular public schools do.
Even higher than public schools.
Oh yeah, even higher than regular public schools, because they will not have, they're not really hoping to have that big cadre of super veterans. That doesn't mean they won't have any, but they figured out that they're happy to have a lot of teachers who have 4 or 5 years of experience.
Okay.
Thank you very much.